Welcome to our webinar on how you can enhance the return of performance management in your organisation. Just before we get into it, let's perhaps just ask ourselves why we should do this. Is it because perhaps we think we should, or maybe because we believe it's our role or somehow our responsibility? Perhaps it's because we believe that it somehow improves employee engagement, or alternatively, perhaps we believe it has an impact on reducing employee turnover and absenteeism. Or alternatively, perhaps it's quite simply because we believe that our businesses will perform better as a result. All of these are true, but really the first four tend to be not necessarily expressed in the language of the business. And I think if we are going to get the business engaged in what we're trying to do, we do need to be very focused on why we're doing this. And it is because our business will perform better as a result of better performance management. And therein, of course, lies the challenge in that how do we express performance management in language which isn't HR type language, but much more about the language of the business, language of numbers, where our arguments are going to be much more persuasive. Well, to do this, I'd like to introduce you to 3 facts, 1 key performance indicator, and 1 truth. And it's really these will form the basis of this webinar and of the model that we have for calculating and improving the return on investment. So the first fact then, and that is that organisations create some form of value through its activities, and this is really a universal in the sense that it doesn't matter whether an organisation is private or in the public sector, whether it delivers services against a budget or whether it has a revenue or profit motive. All organisations have some kind of quantifiable output. Having said that, of course, while that is true of all organisations, the way organisations are structured, the way that they're managed, staffed, are materially different. They have different overheads, different pay structures, numbers of locations, benefit systems, all of these types of things. So there are many material differences that will affect your return on investment calculation. Finally, the third fact here is that organisations typically are organised into teams, and it is the actions of people in those teams that really provide the sustainable output of an organisation. It's not about capital equipment, it's not about other assets, necessarily financial assets or anything else. It is really what people do with the property of the organisation that makes a difference. And people are typically organised in teams led by a manager, and it is that structure where the manager provides some leadership that is common amongst all organisations. So I don't think anybody can really dispute those 3 facts. I think they're all universally true. The key performance indicator is a concept that I'd like you to review and consider, and it is really a way of measuring in a simple way and in a universal way the contribution that we could reasonably expect any employee, regardless of where they are in the organisation. And it is understanding and being able to quantify the difference between what could be allocated to them as a contribution versus what we can calculate that it costs to employ them. And it is really this net production figure, this KPI, that we're going to be seeking to influence to improve through better performance management. And the final truth that as HR folks we have to hold on to, and that is that it is our actions as HR professionals, it is the choices we make around the introduction of performance management systems, the way that we engage with managers and employees, the what's in it for them, the processes we introduce, the things that we ask them to do in terms of completing documentation or having conversations, that fundamentally is HR's responsibility to make it happen. And we must believe that HR, through doing it better, can influence performance management and ultimately productivity through the organisation. Okay, so just to recap on them then, so here are our 3 facts around organisations creating some quantifiable value or output, there being some material differences between organisations. It's really people that create this value, not assets or capital equipment or anything else, and they're organised in groups led by a manager. What we're trying to influence here is the net production of people. If we can have people producing more for the same, then we are improving the performance of our organizations. And finally, it is HR needs to believe that it's through its actions that better performance management can come about. So if we're going to understand and be able to quantify a return on investment, i.e. a change from a before and after, we really do need to understand where an organization is. And this is always the challenge with any before and after calculation, any proof pointers. Do we actually measure the before, or do we just get on with it? Well, I think what we're going to do here is we're going to show you a very simple way of quantifying and baselining an organization's current performance, and as HR people we're in a very good position to go and gather this kind of information. We can calculate therefore actually some very simple models about the average revenue or operating budget per employee or per manager, but they're still quite crude. We could also get into knowing an average manager salary, but that's really not enough, because there's a big difference between what managers are employed and what a employee, a first-line employee, is costs to employ. So there's some really very material differences, and if we can capture some information about that, then we can show you how to create this return on investment model. So let's do that with a real example, a working example. So this particular organization has these type of metrics: 320 million in annual revenue, 15% being managers, and so forth. And we could probably compare several organizations that have similar numbers, where they're of approximately the same kind of size, but actually fundamentally different in the way that they operate, and their cost to employ someone in these different organizations can be very, very different. So that really leads us to triangulating and to calculating a much more realistic employment cost figure in your organization. So if we just pursue this example a little further, so we know how many employees, we know how many managers, and how many people in HR, and we'll use the HR figure later and the overall revenue figures. We also know the employee costs from a manager, an average manager, and an average salary. And just a note on averages, because we are intending to introduce performance management universally, i.e. for all employees and all managers. We don't need to get too concerned about the fact that, some employees contribute more than others, and some managers contribute more than others, and some teams are more productive or higher performing. I think all of these differences sort of net themselves out when we are talking about introducing performance management universally. So yes, I think it's pretty I don't think there are any disputes over whether some organisations and employees contribute more through their activities, but if we take it as a universal, then these things will net out. What's of interest here is there's the employment cost factor of 177%. Now, where's that come from? Well, most business leaders will know that the actual cost to employ someone can be anything from maybe 150% to 200 or even 300% of their gross salary, and this is because in addition to things like social security payments, benefits, there's also the overhead costs associated with buildings and facilities and insurance, and a whole bunch of other things which all effectively bump it up. Now, how can you come to that realistic figure for your organization? So what we're trying to do is to identify really how much of a difference it makes when organizations are not all the same. And you can simply find this factor here by looking at the personnel cost and add it to your facilities costs that you'll find in your public accounts or in your annual report, and that will give you the ability to calculate the actual cost of employing managers and employees, and generally there's an uplift. In this particular example, there is an uplift of around 177%. With that information in mind, we can now start to look at the actual productivity of this particular organization in terms of a key performance indicator. So we know the £320 million worth of revenue. We know the 375 managers and therefore 375 teams. So therefore we know that on average there are one manager and 6 direct reports in this particular organisation. So therefore we can take the 320 million and divide it by the number of teams that we have, and we can see that the revenue for each team on average is around £853,000. Again, that's on average. Because we know the average manager and employee salaries, and we've got the employment cost factor, we can also calculate what it costs to employ that particular team. Therefore, the net value add for any team in this organisation is simply the difference of those two numbers. So the net contribution of every team on average in this organisation is £517,000. Okay. So before we go on to, now that we've baselined this particular organisation, let's also look at how performance management currently operates in this particular business, and also look at some of the HR type of factors that are involved. So you need to ask yourself, so we know how many are in the HR team, but also we need to look at how much time managers spent per direct report each year on a one-to-one. We need to be looking at how much time a manager is spending writing up notes and HR chasing. There are some benefits from moving performance management online by changing the way that performance management is done to try and eliminate or reduce some of these factors. And intuitively we all know that moving things from paper or from Word documents and so forth onto the web with more automated reports does provide the opportunity for these online efficiencies. And if we look at a research project we conducted at the end of last year, this was the type of efficiencies, this is where the efficiencies that the organisations in this research project cited that they were getting some benefits. So the conversation in a face-to-face meeting was much more focused because they had access to performance progress information, but they didn't spend any less time. They just had a better discussion, a more focused discussion. And there was much less time associated with producing reports, much less data entry and rekeying, and lack of confidence in two versions of the truth, and also the typical bugbear of HR around constantly chasing people around to get different pieces of information finished or in different formats, and doing all data entry and filling things in and all the rest of it. So there are some benefits through efficiencies. Again, if we look to quantify those and say in this particular organisation that we're referring to, how much actually was spent doing this. So if we look at just simply chasing employees to get things done, if we look at the reporting required for every manager around team strengths or team goals and objectives, team status, all of these types of things, if we look at the whole finalisation process, which invariably comes towards the end of the year around finishing, the finishing off the reviews and providing final ratings and scores that may be used for pay and reward or bonus and all of these types of things, then on average, these were the types of figures that HR organisations were saying that they were spending, and we can quantify those in exactly the same way. So in this particular organisation, they were spending potentially £120,000 more than they needed to in some of these administrative tasks. And that doesn't sound like a particularly small number, but in the context of this particular organisation, it's really actually very, very small. Our research showed, and the organisations in this particular research demonstrated, that it really wasn't the driver of return on investment, really wasn't the online efficiencies. It wasn't about it just being quicker and simpler and these types of things. There wasn't a message in there around actually managers are going to spend less time, or it was going to somehow make the manager's job easier by making it just quite simply slicker. That wasn't the big goal, and no manager really believes that the introduction of a new system is necessarily going to save them huge amounts of time. Really, where this return on investment came from in this research project, it showed that it was the better use of time, it was the more relevant development activities, the more focused conversations, the more conversations about performance and how it came about and overcoming objections and these types of things that really made the big difference. So if we just return for a second to our 3 facts and our key performance indicator and our truth, and let's look at what HR has managed to achieve in those organisations, so we can challenge ourselves on the truth about what HR is able to do. So in the organisations in our research project, 80% cited that there was better goal alignment through improved performance management with tools and training. 2/3 were talking about and witnessing a greater achievement of objectives being set, and other figures around better engagement and performance issues being tackled more readily. So I think the research shows quite clearly that by improving performance management in an organisation and with HR driving it forward, these kind of benefits are typical of what organisations can achieve. So I think when we challenge ourselves on the truth, I think we can believe that these things are actually possible and that other organisations have really borne this out. But let's just look at some of the areas where better performance management might make a business impact. So for example, in your own organisation, do you know that employees' objectives are aligned with those of the business? And if they are, or if you intend them to be, what kind of impact would you think, or would you believe that would make? Do you think it would make 1% difference to an employee's performance in a year? Just 1% or 5% or perhaps more? Alternatively, if your organisation does or doesn't use SMART objectives, really what difference does that make? And one of the reasons for asking these or posing these questions and to perhaps put a number on it is really to bring to the fore the fact that there is absolutely no empirical research out there which suggests that any of these things make a material business impact. And that's a great shame that none of this research actually exists. But I think intuitively what we all know is that these things do make a positive difference. It is a question of how much a positive difference. And if we move further on into perhaps things like team-based objectives, does your organisation do that? Do you think that makes a big difference in terms of organisational team-based performance? And similarly, if this is around having more effective performance discussions, does that make a big difference in terms of overall business impact? So if a manager was to have a more effective performance discussion with their with the people in their teams, would that make a 1% difference? Well, I think intuitively you think it must make much more than 1% to have a much more effective performance discussion around where a particular objective is and perhaps what's holding it up, or the change in behaviour required, and all of these types of things. Isn't that really what this is all about? And 1%? Well, maybe, but perhaps maybe more. Perhaps even on the softer side, if we have managers transitioning their style from possibly being rather one-sided or overly directive, perhaps if they coach their people more around helping them find the answers, perhaps would help and have a business impact in terms of people being more self-reliant and self-determining in terms of how they achieve their work. Would there be some other spin-off organisational benefits from stimulating that? So if we just take these 5 different things and say, well, if we were to do these 5, well, as an HR organisation, and we know that we can make a difference, and other organisations have made a difference, well, if we were to do some of these things, what would we bet on? How much would we say? Well, what if we were just to say 1%? So if we were to do just some of those things, now perhaps we already do SMART objectives, but we don't do team objectives, and perhaps one of the things we're trying to do is to encourage managers to be more like coaches. So if we just take a couple of those things and say we reckon, or we believe that by changing the behaviour in those ways will make 1% difference to each employee on average, well, what would that mean overall? Well, if I bring you back to the numbers we had at the beginning, which is to say the net value add per team was £517,000, which is the difference between their employment costs and their revenue that could be attributed to their activities, then 1% of that is just £5,170 per team. Now, of course, that's not the whole picture, and there are 375 teams out there. So that adds up to close to £2 million worth of potential net productivity improvement by doing maybe 1 or 2 of those things around SMART goals or team-based objectives and cascading and these types of things. But that's not the whole picture. That's just part of the investment calculation. So let's look at a typical project so we can fill out some of the investment side of this. And if we were to take perhaps the first year's costs and look at the hard costs around possibly acquiring performance management tools, but also look at the other side of it with respect to implementation and some of the people things which generally are far more significant. And if we also take a view which is to say that we're going to account for people's time properly, we're not going to say, well, it's just an hour in someone's day. We're going to recognise the opportunity cost of them not doing something else. Then I think what we're looking at here is a project which has got some key elements of people's time around training HR people on how to use the system, perhaps running some pilots and recognising how many people might be involved in those pilots. So here we've got 10% of the populace, so 250 people spending some time piloting, doing some work around internal change and communications, making sure this is bedded in, managing change appropriately for something like this, but also system training for managers. It's a key part of this is making sure they know how to use the system properly in the way you want them to use it. Web-based performance management systems shouldn't be difficult for managers to use, but it's about getting them to use it in the way you want them to use it. And also not forgetting the amount of time that we really want to be investing in managers to help them exhibit some of the performance management type behaviours that we're looking for around understanding what SMART is if they don't, understanding of the benefit of a team objective and perhaps when they should introduce one, understanding the implications for cascading goals and why that's important, and also looking at the system training for employees to make sure that they are undertaking the kind of things that they need to be doing, as well as also understanding what's in it for them, which will often come out of the internal change and communications part of this. So there is some investment in here, if we quantify as real time, of some £200,000 to implement this kind of system for an organisation of this size. So if we look at all of that and bring it all together and then just take 50% of that return, that incremental return that we were talking about, so 50% of that 1.9 million in the first year, we take the online efficiencies around not having to chase people around so much and be able to produce reports more quickly, and we also take the investment cost away from this, recognising the cost of doing this in terms of time and systems. Well, all of that still gives a 5 times return on investment in the first year. Now, of course, in the second year, a lot of those costs that are in the investment line really don't reoccur, certainly nowhere near to the same degree. So in subsequent years, we're looking at a return on investment significantly more than this. So if we go back and think, okay, we've now got a picture where perhaps 5 times return is a real possibility. Certainly in that particular organisation, that's what they were looking at. And we're being very, very conservative about that return, and we're being quite robust about the cost of investment. And we've got organisations saying that 80% of them have got better goal alignment and 50% are increasing engagement. Do we think that we could get 1% more out of our organisation through introducing better performance management when actually we're witnessing these kind of figures from other organisations? Well, I think we'd have to be saying at least 1% really. Otherwise, we probably should switch the lights out as we leave. Okay, so Headlight can help you with this, and we can help you create a personalised return on investment model for your organisation. It will give you a good baseline of where you are and perhaps where you could get to. You'll be able to understand the different performance management enhancements or improvements and identify what contribution that might make, and that will help you sell it in, talk to the CFO around budgets, getting priorities, deal with skeptics, also create a what's in it for them. It informs your internal change and communications type strategies around what it is you're really asking managers to do and really what's in it for them. We can support your in-house training activities. We run training programs on talent management for managers so they understand better around performance and what performance management is and managing potential and all of these other types of activities. And of course, as a software organisation, we can provide the software tools to help you manage an enterprise-wide performance management implementation. clearly the software that we have and we produce incorporates all of this good practice. It enables you to do all of the things that we've talked about in this particular webinar, and you have our guarantee that we will work with you to make sure that the return on investment picture that we create with you and for you is very realizable, and we'll work with you to ensure that it does happen. So thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and helpful. If you'd like to contact us, please do. Our website address is just coming up, and we'd be delighted to work with you. Thank you.